Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the specially called meeting and workshop for Tuesday, December the 10th. On a personal note, it's good to be back, although not at 100%. And I thank Dr. Young in his absence for covering for me in my absence. So, Ms. Hilbert, will you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Councilman De La Garza?
I am present.
Councilman Kidder?
Here.
Councilwoman Butler?
Present.
Councilwoman Scott?
Here.
Councilman Lofgren?
Here.
And Mayor Crocker.
Here. If you would please join me for the pledges and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Thank you. Please be seated. Again, welcome everyone. I know we have a busy agenda today, so we'll jump right in. Mr. Garza, do you have any announcements or reminders for us this afternoon?
I do not.
Okay. How about public and employee recognitions?
Not today.
You're making it easy on us. All right. Anybody have any items from council? Seeing none? All right. Then we will jump into citizens' communication. I have no cards. Is there anyone who wishes to provide the council with any comment? Seeing none, then we will jump into the item C, which is the consent agenda. Ms. Hilbert.
Yes, sir. Item C1 is an ordinance amending the 2024-2025 budget of the City of Victoria for costs related to the PTO buyout program in the amount of $1,226,076. This item is on second and third reading. Item C2 is an ordinance amending the 2024-2025 budget of the City of Victoria to keep our TMRS plan for retroactive COLA in the amount of $203,966. This item is also on second and third reading.
Thank you, Ms. Hilbert. Do I have a motion with respect to the consent agenda?
Motion to approve the consent agenda. Second.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent agenda passes. So that moves us straight into our city manager's reports. Mr. Garza.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Well, here comes again our fourth quarter council workshop, and it's become customary that at this particular workshop, we talk a little bit about debt capacity. And so to kick off today's workshop, I'm going to ask Gilbert to provide his annual report. I won't steal any of his thunder, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. Well, we don't have the lunch, and we don't have the liquor after this, so that's not the normal process, is it?
Yes, can we take that off the recording?
Oh, okay. Hi, council. How y'all doing today? I hope everybody's doing fine. It's my privilege to be up here since I'm not allowed to get up here too often, so thank you very much. Like I just mentioned, I'm going to give you an update on the debt capacity. And some of y'all already seen some of these slides. I have updated it, but still I thought for the new council people and the public that might be interested, they might want to have a little refresher course. I want to talk about the GOs and COs, and then I'm going to skedaddle over to the revenue bonds, two different animals in itself. Let's talk about the GO-CO. I know it's a little busy slide, but there's a lot of information here, I know. My objective today is to talk about the debt capacity, which in order to have your debt capacity, you need a debt management plan, which ties into your CIP program. As you're well, we have a program over so many years, and it calls for so much debt for each particular year. So all that ties in together. So you have to have a plan in place. You can't start selling debt crazy and not worry about everything else and consequences. With that said, you have to have a balanced debt plan itself. You got the economy to worry about, you got the taxpayer to worry about, and at the same time, you got to worry about the outstanding debt. That makes sense? No difference in any personal finances. Your own, your credit cards, your mortgage, and everything else. Same logic here. The one thing I want to make sure, it's not a Dave Ramsey class, okay? Because I want to talk about why the city needs debt, the type of bonds we issue, and kind of define debt capacity for you in a way. The last slide on the bottom, just to recap, is that currently, right now, we're sitting about 60% of our tax rate is M&O, and 30% is debt tax rate. Back in 2019, it was higher, as Mark recalls, where you had an M&O around the 58% and the debt tax rate at 42. What that tells me, as a result of investment and economy growing, you have be able to modify that debt capacity ratio to lower, because the optimal point you want to be at is you have your debt higher than your debt, your M&O higher than your debt, but still able to sell debt because the economy absorbing any type of expansion through the tax rate with your tax base. And I'll show you that in a minute what I'm talking about. Another thing I want to make sure everybody understands that in the prior years, we had two types of laws that limit our use on the M&O tax. You had your prior law before the SB2, which allowed the city to increase the M&O tax rate up to 8% before the rollback. We don't have that privilege anymore. Not that we ever used in the past, but now the whole key here is that you might have a debt tax rate, and we've done this in the past, that has dropped maybe 2 or 3 pennies, right? But due to the SB, you're only limited to maybe 3.5, which in our case, usually a penny. That's it, and you lose the rest. I don't think it's fair, but it is what it is. That's the law. Any questions there? I just want a little background there. So moving ahead, why debt? Well, it's pretty, yes, ma'am.
You didn't give me a long enough pause, I'm sorry. No, back on the 3.5%, that's 3.5% of the entire tax rate, not the prior M&O tax rate, or it's the M&O tax rate.
It's the M&O
So it's
effective tax rate, I call it. Your
3.5%
no new rate,
of
M&O,
the-
3.5 of that.
Of the M&O part.
Exactly. So in other words, you calculate your no new rate calculation, and then you calculate of that, what is your M&O side of it? You figure out what you did last year. That number is allowed to go up 3.5 only, period, end of story.
And so if your M&O is low, it's even lower.
Correct, it can go
That
either way.
3.5%. Thank you.
Good question. All right, why debt? I'm not gonna read all that up there, but basically, for a city to continue to grow, you have to have the economic base in place and continue maintaining that economic base, infrastructure, street, buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of cities don't have that capital on hand on a given time. So that's where the debt comes into play. It's like a mortgage. You sell the bonds and you pay it over so many years. In our case, we used to do 20. You can go further than that, but I don't like to do that. And you can do any type of debt structure. You can do interest first, principal later. You can do all kind of gimmicks, but I just like to have the interest paid and the principal paid off as soon as possible. What we normally do is that when we sell debt, the debts are sold in batches of 5,000s with a different maturity for each one. It's not necessarily like a mortgage, but it works somewhat like that. So that when we talk about redemption, we're buying bonds, we go and pick the ones we want to create debt capacity in the future or to save money, okay? Now, debt, any given city, I'll stand on this, is an effective tool if it's a use appropriate. There are cities, maybe they go to the extreme and sell debt to the maximum. That is something you might not want to consider. You gotta keep the taxpayer in mind. Any question? This thing works for me, nobody else, I guess. Okay, good. Types of debt. I can list a bunch of debt types that a city can do. I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna list the ones we typically do. General obligation bonds. Basically, you pledge your tax revenue, your property tax revenue, and you go out for a bond election. You list the project, describe the project, and you list the price and how you're gonna pay for it. That's one option. We've done those in the past. It's been a while, but we've done them. You got your COs, the certificate of obligation. You can pledge your property taxes. You can pledge other type of revenue, or you can pledge utility revenues too. Either way. These, you don't need a bond election. However, the voters can petition. If you get 5% of the registered voters, then you would have to put that on the ballot or just say, well, forget it. So it's up to y'all. Revenue bonds almost work like a CO, but in this case, it's strictly related to the income producing facility. In our case, Utility, water and wastewater operations. We sell government bonds out of that, and the water rates pay for that, nothing else. Any questions? And you don't need an election for that one. Just because you don't need an election, you know, if you want to spend the money, you can do it, but you don't need to. Now, what is debt capacity? Well, in government, debt capacity and debt affordability are kind of hands in hands. It's the ability to borrow and handle debt. For government, it's all mixed in together. But if you want to break it apart, debt capacity focus more on the accounting of the debt related to the economic base. You have to have a base to have that capacity and cash flow, okay? Debt affordability relates to more how much your taxpayer can really afford in that entity, a government entity, okay? Now, with that said, debt capacity and affordability can be influenced by several different factors. First, of course, you got your tax rate. Council can go up on it, go down on it, or leave it the same. That would have some type of impact on your debt capacity. Redemption bond. Well, the more you pay off, the more debt capacity you have in the future, or you don't have in the future, but your debt goes down and you have interest saving. New debt. If you issue new debt, same thing, it can go the other way. The economy influences greatly, which also would affect your interest rates. Taxpayers. One thing about here is two things, actually. Just because your appraisals go up doesn't mean the per capita income in their pocket go up. Yeah, keep that in mind. Second, not only our debt is considered, you got other debt to consider. You got VISD, college. You have one taxpayer, remember this. And you got all these entities, so they have the ability to issue debt. So it works that way too, unfortunately. And from a rating agency's perspective, they look at that too as well, which makes sense. And of course, appraisals, they can go up or down. And that would have an impact on your debt capacity. Now, I like to use the past history to show you an example. So I'm taking the Gill's time machine, going back to 2023, okay? Now, what you see in front of you is a graph of your debt service. Before we sold that big chunk of bond, $50-some million, remember, for the public safety building and the streets. Our debt service went from $10 million to 7.3. That's about a $2.8 million drop in cash flow. In other words, that's cash that we have on hand. That's a form of debt capacity. That's just an example of debt capacity. Does that make sense? The more cash you have, the more cash, more debt you can deal because you don't have that debt outstanding. Another way to look at it, what we do also is that just because your debt serves at a certain rate, we or I, or in this case, in the future, Wesley, will look into your debt service fund. We have other revenues that we apply to the debt. You got delinquent taxes, interest, you got, what am I missing? Interest income? No, I'm missing one of them. You got your sales tax that they can contribute over 10 years. That would also help your debt capacity. You're just shaking your head, disagreeing with me. That's all you're doing. The third example of debt capacity, as you recall, we went from fiscal year 23-24, we jumped about at 19.8% in our appraised values. You recall that? That alone has created some huge debt capacity situation. Because as you remember in the previous slide, it's based on the economic base. So that's what good example is that that's why economy, improving it, growing it, is a key factor. And I think all of y'all have mentioned it before. Okay? That plays big. So you have those items to think about. So the scenario we had back then, I had these options, and we played it out with y'all too. We had an option that, all right, what happens if we don't sell any debt? Well, you get to drop your debt tax rate by 8 cents or something. And then your M&O would go down, that was a given, 4.6. So your overall tax rate would drop 13.2. Now, that's an option one. But guess what? There's no CIP. There's no public safety. There's no street. There's nada. Okay, That's not what we want to go with because we already had a CIP plan. We already had a strategy what we're going to do. But anyway, we still look at option 2. What happened when we max it out? Well, you can max it out. The debt tax rate will not drop. The only thing you drop is your M&O will go down 4.6. And that means you probably have another $15 to $16 million of debt capacity, but to do what? And that's one of the key things we've done in the past. We kind of maximize our debt, but we need to plan for that debt. All right, we sell a debt, so are we going to need any debt another next year or the following year? So that's why that strategy in the CIP comes in play hand in hand with it. Does that make sense to y'all? So you don't want to sell all this knowing that a year following you got another debt you want to issue. So you want to play it out. Okay, how can we take advantage of this cash flow, do some redemption, and keep moving forward without having a major effect on the taxpayer? At the same time, knock on wood, we're being lucky dropping the debt tax rate all the time. Of course, we did the last option 3, where let's go with our plan of action that we wanted to do. We dropped the debt by 2 cents. M&O went down to 4. Total tax rate went down 6.84, and we were able to do our CIP, and everything works as we planned. Make sense?
And Gilbert, I think one way to describe it, and I think it's the way that we've sometimes described it in the past when we go through the budget process, is trying to find a comfortable spot in the middle, right? Where we're not completely maximizing the amount of money that we bring in, but we're also not completely depleting the opportunity that presents itself. And so that third option is a perfect example of that.
Thank you. Okay? No, I mean, it makes me feel good. It's like somebody's, leave Victoria and somebody's picking up the ropes,
That's already like 3 references to him like leaving the organization in like 15 minutes.
I did?
Do I need to cut you off before it gets?
Second one?
Maybe he's dropping a hint.
No. Folks, I enjoy actually, matter of fact, you want to go there? I go there. It's like, I'm enjoying my life. This is nice because I do love Victoria. This is really personal to me because this is my life. This is my city. I got a daughter. I got a wife. And this is a town we're not going anywhere. So I do have some accountability in this town. And I love this place. That's why, I can say all these dumb things around here, but I'm not going anywhere. And
We
if I
appreciate
get
that.
fired, I'll be out there making sure I'm over here getting my 5 minutes. It's like, either way.
You only get 3.
3 minutes? I don't get 5? Anyway, thank
But
you,
you have a
sis.
time machine that we don't have, so you can stay in
Go back
Victoria
and
and leave.
forth. All serious side, thank you for that. Now let's go back to 2025. Let's see, here I want to play out, what are we looking at right now and how are we going to move forward? On the left-hand side is what I'm thinking about right now, your tax appraised value growth would be. As you well know, in 24, we're at the 19.8. This past tax roll, we had about 7. And so I said, okay, let's keep this at 3.5, 3.33, and I'll drop down to 2. I don't want to be too aggressive. And I will explain why I try to keep it low, because it creates flexibility in when your actual appraisals come on, then you can do some other things, which you have done in the past. For example, I had a less than 3.7 for 2025. Well, we already knew what that rate will be. So if I got anything higher than that, guess what? We lowered the tax rate. So you're getting what you need on the debt side. At the same time, you make an accommodation in the future to also relieve the taxpayer. Make sense? All right. And then one thing, as Susan noted when I made this presentation, is that I got a little conservative because I used to have 1s down the bottom on the latter years. So he thought I was really liberal.
That was the first thing I noticed. I was like, I'm so proud, Gilbert. You
So I went up a tad.
graduated away from 1 and 1.5% assumptions to 3. Like that's legit.
I had to step out of my comfort zone, okay? But watch happens now, okay. On the right-hand side, that's the annual debt service, meaning that's the amount that you paid out on an annual basis that we're required by law, okay? However, as I mentioned before, I'll look into the fund balance of the debt service and see, okay, what money can I apply to it to minimize that debt service, which can directly minimize the tax effect. As you well know also, we also have the sales tax money that also reduced that effect too. So that's a form, like I mentioned that before. If you take that consideration, the brown line on the bottom is the actual tax rate that we need to service in the coming years, okay? But for right now, for this presentation, I'm making an assumption that we'll maintain the tax rate at 728, which we have right now, moving forward, just straight line. For some reason, if those appraised values come in higher, guess what? You get to lower that tax rate, which we've done in the past. If I set those things really high, come up with great debt capacity numbers, I guarantee you, we won't have to retract and backtrack because we'll have to readjust the CIP because we were too aggressive. So I like to start from the bottom up. So by doing that, you have created some debt capacity moving forward. Does that make sense? So assuming that these scenarios play out, what it looks like basically for the next 6 years, which is rusty brown, I guess, the color, yeah. It's $78 million over the years. With the assumption that we played out in 25 budget, that we plan to sell $6 million according to the CIP program, okay? That's what it looks like. Another way to look at it, it's like, okay, if we don't sell any debt for 26 all the way to 31st, what that tax rate will look like is the blue line. So your tax rate starts to drop. If you sell all that debt, your tax rate will maintain straight with the assumption those price values are where they're at and everything else, okay? Now, Gail, we say we have a CIP. Yes, we do have a CIP, Gail. In our CIP for 27, 28, and 29, we're showing $10 million in each year. I don't know if you remember, but we have that planned out. As you can see up there, there's 13, 14, and 3. That's not gonna work for us. So what we're gonna do, if it's okay with y'all, you gotta prove it, let's do some redemption. What's gonna happen, we take the money that we don't use selling the bonds in 27 and 28 and redeem some bonds in 29. So what happens there is that you have reduced the capacity in 27, 28, because you can use some of that money to redeem the bonds in 29, and now you have set yourself up with a nice 10, 10, 10. And at the same time, I didn't show it here, you got some interest savings. Make sense? Questions? And folks, it's not that easy. I just try to keep it easy for y'all, so. Okay? Now, look at that, boom. I like that. I've always been told about, yeah, you have all this debt capacity, but you also gotta look at your outstanding debt. You know, you can't continue doing your debt without also looking at the other side of the coin. So where you at that, where your outstanding debt liability situation is. You know, you wanna keep that in balance too as well. So anyway, moving forward, before we sold the debt, that's our debt outstanding line. Heck, in 10 years, we've been paid off, no more debt. But we'll probably be behind in replacing streets, doing all this economic-based infrastructure that's needed on a growing city. Even though we're not growing as fast as we want, you still have to replace them, like it or not. We don't want to be a dying city. So as a result of that, in addition to that, we also had that growth in tax appraised value, the 19.8, remember that? So we came back and sold $50-something million in bonds for the public safety building street, while at the same time, the tax rate went down on the M&O and debt. That's pretty good. So the pockets went down, but you ever accomplished your objective. That's the key point. How do you strategize this moving forward? And there might be times that we have to bite the bullet, okay, you know, appraisal's not coming up, but we still got to keep forward with the economic growth. We have to make that decision. Does it have to be now, or do we do a little different? And it's not perfect world like this all the time. We're gonna have some bad times. Luckily, not Mike's watch. Anyway, here's the other one that we're planning to sell right now for the, I believe is what? Can't read that far. 7
Right
million?
in front of you too.
You know, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I can see that. $6 million. And by the way, these are my old glasses, so if I see a different number, because they're not my prescription glasses, so seriously. $6 million, that's what your debt outstanding looks like. It goes from 83 to 82. Why did it go that way? Because we're doing some redemption, remember that. And then you go back, okay, we're going to do another bond issue, hopefully in 26, and that's going to be about $8 million for right now. And then we come back in 27, 28, and 29. Those are your 3 years that we thought about doing 10, 10, 10. Remember that? But guess what? Look, I'm going to use this thing. Does it work? No, it doesn't work. James, yeah, it does work. Look at that. It starts to increase. You got to watch out for that.
It's on here too.
It is?
Yeah.
Wow, I'm impressed with you, James. Okay, so anyway, you start to see a trend there, right? There's an upward trend on your outstanding liability that say, okay, cautious, cautious. And that's when you start looking, okay, how do I play this in with the upcoming debt needed for CIP and everything else? And does it look like in the future with my debt payments being paid off? And as you can see, it starts going up, but within a couple of years, it's going to start dropping. That's okay. And then I can start playing again. You know, not playing again. It's not like at the lotto deal, but it's okay. I can start maybe planning my debt capacity a year, 2 years out there in the road. Since I'm dropping about $2.7 million in debt service, we're back to the same score we did back in 2023, with our debt dropping 12.6, okay? With the assumption we still have that growth playing out on our tax base. If it's higher, it's much better looking than this. Okay, so what I'm trying to say on the right-hand side is my whole point is that it's okay to have that increase, but watch out. It's only for a short period of time. Make sure there's a drop in a short period of time where you can take advantage of those drops conservatively, continue paying off your debt early, redemption, refinance is possible whenever it's needed. It is always crucial that you need to have a debt plan in your CIP and on your debt capacity on an annual basis, tie that in with the economy, how things look, if everything's in balance, are we in good shape? But overall, one of the biggest things a lot of people get in trouble with, they don't stay within their means. Even personal, when you go out to buy a car, a house, we kind of over leverage ourselves. Try not to do that. If you keep those type of rules in place, you can continue growth and everything else fine. At the same time, the taxpayer will be happy, the tax rate will be going down if we have that growth. Does that make sense for you? Perfect. Now, the easy part comes out now. Let's talk about revenue bond. After I have a drink. Revenue bond, I love revenue bonds. On the left-hand side, you got your annual debt service. It's dropping like a hot potato. Your outstanding principal, same there, okay? Now, let me give you a little background. A lot of y'all probably know this. Our utility rates is composed of two components. You got a variable rate and a base rate. The base rate, you're guaranteed to get that because that's the minimum you're gonna get from a taxpayer, no matter what it is, right? You can pay a certain amount every time. The variable rate depends on the usage, okay? In the past years, when I started coming on board, I made sure that your debt was paid off from the fixed rate. Okay, so I'm guaranteeing that money so I can do my service payment. I don't want to have that risk involved, put it on my variable rate and not have a wet season, all that. I don't have enough money for the operation or the debt payment. So in all these years, we have always, if we issue debt, we increase the fixed rate portion of it. That makes sense? As a result of that, in prior years, like in 22, 21, our debt service back then was about $9.25 million. And it has dropped. And one of the key points, and we started this back in 2020, and one of the conversations we had is if we want to have a more of aggressive CIP where we have more cash available for us to do and do more projects, why don't we leave the debt? We don't decrease the rate. We leave the rate generating $9 million. We take the portion that we don't need. In this case, like for 25, I'm required only a $5 million debt service. That means I got $4 million available cash. Two choices. We reduce the tax, the utility rates, or we use that money to do infrastructure needs instead of issuing bonds, cash basis. Does that make sense? Okay. So that is not to say that's going to continue, because back then I said there's some decisions going to have to be made. I'll talk about it in a minute. But you understand the cash flow there? So we've been using that extra cash flow from the debt capacity to fund our CIP side of it, utility project and everything else. And that's how we've done, and that's why we haven't done any revenue bond the past 5 years. Because if you do revenue bonds, guess what? You increase the utility side. You let it go all the way, and then you put it back on. So let's get to a point where we're at a situation, because we're going to have another study coming before y'all that plays in with this concept too as well. I'll get to that in a minute. But does everybody understand that? Okay. And I like graphs, so I just plotted it out what your debt service looked like for the calendar year. That's all I have to say about that slide. Thank you.
Beautiful
Now-
slide.
I know. Now, if you do debt, if we ever issue debt, what's our capacity right now? Well, if you issue debt right now in 25 and for the next year out to 44, we got about $116 million debt capacity, meaning that our utility rate has to go back generating 9.3. That means we don't have to increase our utility rates. You already have it at $9 million, and you can issue all this debt if you want to. But I rebuttal saying, well, what are you going to use that on? As I mentioned before, you have a CIP. Stick to the plan. If you need some debt for a revenue bond, then let's do it according to the plan, how everything fits together. That's all I'm saying. There's no need right now. There's another reason why I would like y'all to wait. You have the stormwater utility rate study coming before you, okay? And you might say, okay, why don't we use some of this utility rate on the water side and move that over to the stormwater rate and facilitates the residential so that they won't get impacted that big. Does that make sense? Say it goes up $1 over here, well, let's take $1 over here so everybody's equal. So I don't know if that's gonna be like that, but you minimize the impact on residential. When that study comes back, you have this flexibility to start playing with that cash flow. The other side of the coin, council, you gotta think about, do you got used to this cash for the CIP or what? So those are the decisions we gotta talk about, okay? Not only that, if we go forward with a new fund, which is going to be an enterprise fund itself. Eventually, it can be able to do its own bonds and everything else, but you have to create a reserve working capital. You have to put some money in there so it can start growing on itself. And that money will come, guess what? From that cash from the utility side as a seed money. Make sense? It's a financial plan, but we still have to come together and fine tune that plan now. Questions? Here's my mic. Poof. Council, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. Appreciate all that you do, and good to hear that you're not going anywhere. I'm gonna hold you to that. So. No, I mean for the rest of the meeting. Go ahead.
So thank you, Gilbert. That was very educational for everybody, I hope. The only thing that I'll add to that is one of the other factors that is also very important to keep in mind as we try and figure out how much debt we issue, how many projects we take on, of course, is our own capacity to administer the implementation of those projects. And so you may recall us in previous years, specifically 2 years ago, we presented you a plan to try and build up our engineering and capital improvement department in anticipation of the increased number of projects that we wanted to do. That growth in that department, unfortunately, has not taken place the way that we had originally envisioned because of just challenges in hiring civil engineers and so on and so forth. So that's just something that I ask that we also keep in mind. And so as we discuss in general moving forward, future CIPs, that we also not lose sight of the fact that we need to also talk about the staffing element of it. So, okay. So If there are no other questions to Gilbert's presentation, I want to transition to an update on the community center master plan. Very intentional that I talk about this right after Gilbert, because I will be talking a little bit about how to possibly fund the improvements of the community center, which would take up some of the debt capacity that Gilbert just shared with all of us. I'm not going to, Gilbert is correct. This thing only works for him. Okay, there we go. Okay. Oh, man. It's not. Okay, so I'm not going to recap the entire community center master plan. I did include a couple of slides simply just as a refresher, because what I really want to talk about is the funding aspect of the project. But just at a very high level, this aerial depicts some of the major enhancements that the plan recommends. The biggest one being number 6, which is the new covered arena. Of course, there's a renovation of the existing facility, which is labeled as number 3. Number 7 is a new barn that would be built, because part of what we would want to do with the existing facility is convert the existing rectangular arena in the back into a concrete, air-conditioned space to serve as an exhibition hall that could provide greater flexibility to hosting more events, larger events, things of that sort. And so naturally, if we convert this space into an air-conditioned space, we wouldn't want to put any animals in it. So that's why that barn here labeled as number 7 would be necessary in order to increase the capacity of where to keep animals during a livestock show, as an example. There's, of course, some site improvements to it, some entrance enhancements. These are just some of the renderings from the plan. These are some renderings from the arena, just to give you a quick refresher on that. It was 3,000 seats. On the upper left-hand side, 3,000 fixed seats. In a concert setting, it could be anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000. Recall that as part of the development of this plan, there was a very robust, I'll hit on it later, but I'll mention it now as well. There was a very robust community input process, stakeholder input process as part of this. This is just another rendering kind of showing some of the site improvements. There'd be an adjustment to where the entrance is to help facilitate better traffic flow. Of course, the addition of some parking spaces. Ultimately, what Todd presented were a couple of options that stemmed from the plan. And there was a roughly $32 million option. We rounded it up to 35 on purpose. And there was roughly a $45 million option. And so we thought it'd be best to just, for easy math purposes, make it a $35 million option and a $45 million option. We feel very comfortable that these numbers have enough contingency in them to account for anything that might happen in the next year or two, depending on when we choose to pull the trigger on the project. As you can see by this slide, the real only difference between these two options is the roof of the new covered arena that is being proposed. Todd alluded to it, and since then, we've received questions, rightfully so, right, about the fabric option. And so what I wanted to do is to walk you through a little bit of the information that was provided by the company that provided the quote and has been working with Populous on the roof to provide just some additional information to you and the public around this product. Now, I'll start by saying that I do not work for the company, so I'm not, intimately familiar with all of the details, but I have had a couple of really good virtual meetings with the company. I did invite them to come to today's presentation, but they couldn't. They had to be at a different location, but they're open to coming back and delving into greater detail. But part of the information that they have together and that they provided with me has quite a bit of information comparing their product with a traditional metal product. Obviously, it's not the first time that they get asked a lot of questions comparing their product to a metal product. And so one of the key elements that I think it's important for us to understand about this option is the steel frame component of it. And I'll show you some pictures and I'll show you a video that very clearly shows the steel component that falls or that is under the fabric. I know that oftentimes people assume, okay, it's a fabric roof, there's probably not going to be a strong support system underneath the fabric. That's not the case. There's a lot of steel that goes under the membrane of this product. So keep that in mind. It'll make sense when I show the pictures. One of the things that the consultant also very clearly points out in having conversations around the difference stem around some of the issues that typically come from metal roofs, whether it's water leaks, some of the, I'm blanking out now on the term, the rust. You don't deal with some of these issues when it's a fabric roof. And so in theory, the suggestion is that the fabric product actually requires less maintenance over time because it doesn't produce the typical issues that a metal roof would. One of the biggest benefits that a lot of people seem to enjoy about that product is some of the light, natural light that can come into the area. There's also some greater opportunity for some better interior liner and some better insulation. I already kind of hit a little bit on the maintenance piece. There's quite a bit of information that the consultant sent on this topic that I will forward you via email. It was literally about a 60-page document. I'm not going to go through a 60-page document, but that document does delve into the details of the thickness of the product, the different options in the product. The product that was quoted for us and that's included in our budget estimate is the top-of-the-line product that they have, which is their thickest, most durable product, 25-year warranty on it, which is consistent with what the warranty would be on a typical metal roof anyway. And so it's important that we all become comfortable with the material and the quality of that product.
Mr. Garza?
Yes.
I know we can all read this, we're listening and reading. Something that's jumping out at me under the fabric roof is the fourth one in the first box. That's, I don't know what keyed it is, but they're individually keyed panels allowed for reduced cost in building repair in the event of an accidental collision or disaster. So
Yeah,
it sounds like it's not one piece of fabric that's stretched over the entire building.
Correct. It's not. It's not. Yeah. It's basically different. When you see the video, it'll make sense. So you've got the steel structure that might be, I don't know for a fact, but it might be 10 feet apart between each steel frame, and each of those fabric panels is just that span. And so if there is an issue with a particular element of it, you could, in theory, just remove that 10-foot piece of the fabric and replace that versus having to replace a larger section of the roof if it's a much larger metal piece.
Yeah,
That's what that means, yeah. And that 60-page document that I'll forward you has a video and even has pictures depicting how the fabric is brought together to create that flush field that eliminates water infiltration. But that's a good observation. I did specifically, by the way, because I think you've asked me the question around, well, we have Tropicana Field, for example, in Florida that, sustained some hurricane damage and the roof basically fell apart. And what was funny was that when I mentioned that to the representative from the company, she immediately laughed, basically. Simply because there's a big difference between that product and this product. There's a big difference in the installation of that product. I mean, if we think about a large dome that way, the steel structure underneath that is not supported as consistently or as thoroughly as a structure like the one that I'll show you right now. So instead of it being like a 10-foot panel, for example, those panels are 100 feet, and so thus making them not as sturdy, for example. She mentioned very specifically that the thickness of that product, because it's an older dome, that the technology and the fabric that was incorporated into that design is 30 years old, and that the fabric that is utilized in this scenario is literally 4 times better than that one, basically, in terms of just quality. And she also made a comment that one was supposed to be replaced like 15 years ago because it had reached end of life, and it never was. And coincidentally, Populous, the firm that we've hired, apparently is the firm that was hired by them to design the replacement of it. And so Todd was saying that they're actually not going to replace that, and they're going to convert it into an open air dome, basically. It's not going to be an enclosed stadium anymore.
Well, you pointed the geography out to me that field was much closer to the coast than we are.
Yes, and I did specifically ask that, and so if there aren't any more questions on this, like I said, I'll provide more information. We have time to figure this out. The rep can come at a future date and delve into some of the greater details of it. It's obviously an important decision because it comes with some real dollar implications. The last element on this is the speed of install. That might play a factor in our consideration as well because of the time constraint that we have to construct this facility in trying to squeeze it in between livestock shows. And I'll share a couple of timeline scenarios later. But the next thing that's gonna pull up is a video of a covered barn in Southwest Florida that just recently went through the hurricanes and survived the hurricane. I specifically asked, can we get pictures, from that facility? She said that the owner of the facility hasn't signed off on agreeing to share photographs of their facility for any sort of marketing or any sort of other purpose. But basically the message was, on that site where this fabric roof facility was, there were some metal buildings, and the metal buildings were the ones that lost the roof, and the fabric roof was the one that did it. So I thought that was very interesting. But I'm gonna let this video play just to give you a feel for, I asked that you notice the steel structure that goes under the fabric, because that's ultimately what brings the strength and durability aspect to it as well. I don't know if I mentioned this, but this one's actually the one in Southwest Florida. So this is the one that survived the hurricane recently. And as soon as that owner gives the legal okay, we'll be able to have pictures and everything of how it fared. The document that I'll send you also has plenty of examples of facilities like this and like the one that we're looking at building that utilize this roof. One of the nearest example that exists for us is actually just right around the corner. And so Texas A&M University actually just opened up an indoor track and field facility. And the roof for that facility is actually the product that is being recommended for our facility. And so like I joked with the consultant, if it's good enough for the Aggies, it's good enough for me.
They could afford a metal roof if they wanted it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I can send you the PDF of this document that shows more specifics. I don't expect you to read this now. But we were also invited by the consultant, if we wanted to take a trip to College Station to see the facility close up, if we wanted to speak with the folks at Texas A&M to learn about, what went into their decision, things of that sort. So everybody's making themselves available to help us better understand how popular this product is becoming because of how, quite frankly, just how much cheaper it is compared to a traditional metal roof. So again, the biggest difference in the cost was the roof. And so we've been talking behind the scenes somewhat, trying to figure out how would we even pay for these options. And so I want to walk you through how we basically came up with $35 and $45 million for these options and talk through some of the implications of those options. So these are a little bit out of order. I'm not going to go through them in order, but I've alluded to in the past the idea of adopting a venue tax project and basically generating some revenue from a venue tax that would increase the hotel occupancy tax by 2%. And so that's in here. And we estimate that that'll allow us to issue a revenue bond of $8 million. That's about $500,000 that 2% would generate. Under the law, and I have another slide that walks through the different options, but under the venue tax laws, we're also able to add a car rental tax, a venue tax to a car rental contract, basically. It's a daily tax. And that would generate roughly $3 million for us in a revenue bond. Gilbert and I have been having conversations with basically the CFO of Enterprise Car Rental. They're not strangers to communities pursuing these types of initiatives, and so they've been very helpful in providing the figures that we would need to help understand how much money we think adopting one would generate. We've also, as part of the process, have become aware of the county's effort to adopt a county hotel occupancy tax, and the county judge has committed that a portion of that would go towards this project, so we've marked that as another $3 million. We've also made the decision internally that on top of the 2% increase to the hotel occupancy tax, there's probably some of our existing revenue that we receive in hotel occupancy that we can also add to that 2% to basically increase the amount of debt that we can issue with that. And that's what that additional 1.5 is. And so as a baseline, those 4 items at the top, right, are sort of the baseline for these for both of these options. And I'll walk through specifically the venue tax in a future slide. Then we start getting into some differentiating factors. So we start getting into the CO issuance. So basically what we're suggesting here is that if we go with a $35 million option, we can issue $15 million in COs to go towards the project. If it's a 45, it's 20. And what you see there in terms of the VS3C reference will make more sense in a future slide. But you may recall from Gilbert's slide, we don't really have any debt capacity until 2031. And so I'll show you with a graphic how we can issue some of this debt sooner. Then there's the VS3C one-time funding that we would pursue, which also increases under the $45 million option. Under the $35 million option, a combination of that $2.5 million plus the roughly 5 that's referenced in parentheses there is about $7.5 million. And in the other option, it's a little over 11. And so one thing to consider as we explore these options is the impact on the cash for VS3C and the impact on the issuance of COs. And then there's just some other sources of funds that we can tap into, interest income. And because part of the project does include site improvements, drainage improvements, we felt comfortable also adding an element from the utility fund. And so I'll walk through the 2 biggest items that were on that chart. The first being the CO debt capacity. This is literally the exact same slide that Gilbert showed you. And he walked you through how we can create that $10 million debt capacity in 29 that wasn't there. So how do we create $15 million in debt capacity soon? Well, it would look something like this. Whoops, let me go back. I don't know why I copied it that way. But basically, it's tapping into that debt that becomes available in 31 and issuing it early. And because we won't be generating the revenue to pay off that debt through the INS rate, we would basically access cash that VS3C, that we would recommend VS3C contributes to the project, so that it's basically funds from VS3C that make the debt service payment for a few years until we get to 2031, where the debt capacity on the INS side can pick it up for the rest of the term. Does that make sense? But obviously there's an impact to that because it decreases the debt availability in 31. If we do the other option, it drops it even more, right? And so we need to have conversations around what's that give and take. What do we feel comfortable with? And then at some point, we got to talk about what to do in 2030. That currently is just shown as 4. Now, we think that our tax base is going to grow greater than the conservative projection that Gilbert shared, that by the time we get to 3 years from now, we think we would have created enough debt capacity through a combination of just taking more advantage of redeeming bonds more aggressively, plus an increase in our appraised values, that 4 and 30 will actually be 10 on its own, kind of just organically once we get to there. But again, you can very clearly see what the impact is on future debt, depending on the amount that we want. So any questions on that part? Okay. Again, trying to make it as easy as possible to kind of understand the mechanics on how we can issue more debt sooner, and how we'd be able to pay for that in the interim. The venue tax. I left in front of you another copy of a document that I distributed at our last workshop, which is basically just straight from the state comptroller's office that describes the venue tax. I mentioned it then and I mention it now. This is how cities pay for projects like this all across the state. That particular section of code allows you to adopt a venue project and then use all sorts of different avenues to help fund it. You can use sales tax, whether it's existing or future sales tax. You can use short-term rental, the car rental. You could use hotel occupancy tax. You can use future event admission and or parking taxes. There's quite a bit of options there. We, of course, are recommending that we consider doing the hotel occupancy tax and the car rental one to help fund our project. And so what we would need to do is basically identify the project. The law very specifically explains what is a qualifying venue project, which ours would be. And we would need to bring a resolution to you at a council meeting, basically suggesting this is the venue project that we want to consider. We have to send that to the state comptroller's office. They have to sort of sign off on it and confirm that it qualifies, that it's not going to have an adverse impact on state revenues. That's just a step. And then ultimately, once we get through that, then it's simply a matter of assuming that we're supportive and you're supportive of either one of those or both, then it's simply a matter of putting it on a ballot measure. And so to that end, I want to walk through the two options. And I'm sorry, I didn't have time to put a pretty graphic together for it. I did tell the mayor this morning that I might not have time for that, so I did not.
You did. I get it.
But basically, the difference between May 2025 and November 2025 is when construction starts. So if we get it done in May of 25, we can start the design for the facility in June of 2025. It would obviously not make sense to enter into a design contract with a design firm until we secure the bulk of the money, right? So we could line up all our ducks in a row to be able to bring the design contract to you in June. The consultant thinks it'll take roughly 6 months to design it. During that process, we would go through the process of selecting an owner's rep, selecting the construction manager at risk, so that ultimately, once the design is complete in December, in January, we can approve that guaranteed maximum price with the construction manager at risk, and construction start in March of 26. Our livestock show takes place every February, so the intent is to start construction immediately right after the livestock show ends, and all of these improvements be completed in time for livestock show 2027. And that's why I alluded to earlier that if the fabric roof option is also helps save time of construction, that's got to be an element of consideration here as well. Now, we're working through working with the company and understanding a better level of specificity to those timing differences. But that's just, I'm putting it out there for food for thought. Now, if we wait until November of 2025, it basically just creates more breathing room for the entire process, because we wouldn't be able to start construction until March of 2027, because there'd be no way to obviously start it in March of 2026. And so I'm not going to repeat the steps. It's the same steps, just with built-in breathing room, that ultimately leads to construction starting in March of 27 instead of March of 26. Now, we know that things are only getting more expensive. And so I know one factor that our lead consultant has mentioned is basically you need to add 5%. You know, of the cost estimates that we provided to you already assume a construction timeframe of 2026. So if we go with the 2027 option, we'd have to just increase that a little bit. But there's enough wiggle room in there that we might be okay. So in order to help you make an informed decision, we've done a couple of things, and I've got a couple of suggestions for you to just on things to think about. But we already know that as a starting point, Populous, our consultant, went through a community survey, went through public input meetings, and so we already know that there's a baseline and quite a bit of support in the community, in the general community, for improvements at the community center. We got a very clear sort of consensus on that through that process. Now, that isn't necessarily reflective of how something like this might do during an election or on the ballot, right? Because not everybody that participates in community surveys or input meetings or comments on Facebook or others are registered to vote. Or if they are, vote, right? And so the logical step was, well, let's try and figure out how our registered voters feel, because they're the ones that are more likely to turn out to vote for the venue tax projects, right? And so we just last month entered into a professional services agreement with Cooksey Communications. This firm is a firm that specializes in marketing, basically marketing for communities that are pursuing bonds that go to the voters. You know, you heard Gilbert talk about how GOs go to voters, right? So cities hire companies like Cooksey to help do the due diligence, help do the marketing and the communication piece leading up to some form of bond election. And so the first order of business for the firm is to poll registered voters in Victoria County. And we're currently going back and forth with them on basically the questions that they're going to ask registered voters. I believe the target is to try and reach 300 registered voters in Victoria County to try and just ascertain their feelings around supporting a project like this if it makes it to the ballot. We're intentionally, and the consultant's intentionally waiting until after the holidays to actually do that polling. And so we expect that at some point in January would be when we would have the results of that polling data that you could use as a decision factor in determining whether you want to do it at all. And if you do, when, right? Other things of consideration, goes without saying, are of course just what are the things might be going on in those election cycles, right? We don't know what we don't know in terms of what might be on the election in May, because we don't control what the school district, for example, might want to put on the ballot. The only thing we know with certainty is, of course, our own elections, which, of course, in May of 25 is mayor and super districts. In November, we know that there is no national, election, but because it's a legislative year, any state constitutional amendments would be on the ballot in November. And so that's also something to consider, not really knowing what those state amendments, constitutional amendments would be. That's what would drive people coming out to vote in November of 2025. So pros and cons to all of that. Another thing to consider is whether we partner with the county to make it a countywide election versus just a city limit election. This was one suggestion that came out of the working group that was put together to talk through this project, because many of the users of the facility live in the county. Many of the stakeholders that are involved with the livestock show live in the county, and if we make it a city-centric election, those individuals would not have an opportunity to vote in support of the measure for the improvements. And so those are all things that we need to think about, the pros and cons of. We have some data through the polling data that we think might help inform that decision, and you might think of others. But ultimately, that's what we need from you, not tonight, but we need from you relatively soon-ish. Because obviously, if we do May, we need to move on that quick.
Relatively soonish.
Well, we need to have a conversation about taking a resolution to council, if not next week, for sure the first meeting in January, sort of qualifying and identifying and describing the venue project so we can send that to the comptroller's office. Now, we can do that and that not affect whether we actually call the election or not. We can start that process just to check that box, right? So I just want to clarify. So we'll begin working on that part. But ultimately, we call for the election in May, and I believe we do that technically in February. We call it formally, the election gets called in February, right?
January.
Yes, sir. Normally, we call it the first meeting in February.
Yeah, and so if we wanted to add this to the ballot in May, we'd have to incorporated as part of the calling of that election. So that's why that process is a little quick.
Well, I know it's quick, but having looked at the costs of elections, which we've all kind of looked at recently, we already have one for May. We do, because of our 3 positions. So it makes sense to me that we would try to do it in May as opposed to having a second election.
Yeah, true. I mean, that's a good point that, we already have money budgeted for the election in May. And we would obviously have to budget some funds if we did it in November, but I don't think that, that's not a doable thing to do. Yes, it's costly to do that, but I think it's a doable thing to do if we needed to pay for the election in November. But that is certainly a consideration for sure. Because the other thing you need to ask yourself is, okay, how much is an election might cost us?
In the last general election, we paid about $30,000 just the May, but now that when we held the special election where we were the only ones involved, that was about $120,000. So it also depends on who else is involved and who we're sharing cost with. So regardless if it's May or November, we would probably share cost with someone. So
Right.
that
A
helps.
countywide
And we
one.
can we could, in theory, just brainstorming out loud, talking through this, we can always reach out to the elections administrator and just sit down with her and run some scenarios, based off what we already know. We know the school district's going to have one in May. So we can just figure that out. Obviously we wouldn't have anything in November, and we don't know if anybody would have anything in November. The school district, in theory, could have another election next November if they decided to try again at increasing the property tax rate to help with teacher pay. Those elections can only be in November. So we know that there would be no election in May for the school district to increase property taxes.
Okay.
But they might have their normal cycle of representatives on the school
I think
board.
they do.
Yeah.
And then if you do it countywide, you can sort of double whatever you thought the city election would be. I think 120 for the full countywide election is a realistic number.
Yeah.
And yes, it could be shared with other people having elections.
Right. And like I said, we can certainly reach out to her and kind of take a deeper dive into that. We hadn't done it up to this point simply because in the grand scheme of things, we were more focused on the millions of dollars, not the millions, but the hundreds of thousands of dollars that it would cost in difference between actually constructing it, in 26 versus 27. So we weren't too focused on the cost of the election. We were focused on the bigger
Yeah.
cost impact.
That's
right?
another reason I'm pushing for May.
And like I said, I don't necessarily need that consensus direction now. I appreciate you sharing it. But that's certainly one thing that you need to think about. Now, that assumes, of course, that you even want to do it, right? Because the other thing that you need to think about is if you want to do it, and if you do want to do it, do you want to do both hotel occupancy tax and car rentals, or do you just want to do one of those two, right? Because those things sort of start to also play into what realistic option is the one that we ought to pursue, right? Because if, for example, you say, we like the idea of the hotel tax, but we don't like the idea of the rental tax, okay, that's fair. Well, then that's $3 million that we have less to work with, that either A, basically means we go with the $35 million option, or B, means that we got to find $3 million somewhere else for the $45 million option, right? And so I ask that you think about, those things. And then ultimately, if you do decide on any one of those, then it's the conversation of whether May or November. Pros and cons to those, right? I shared a very quick timeline if it were to be in May of 25. And then there's a November that creates more breathing room for us, right? And there's value in both of those, right? I could argue about how maybe having it in May could help take advantage of the momentum that we've built in building excitement, around the improvements. But I can also see how waiting till November gives us more time to educate the masses, around what might be on the ballot, right? So there's just some give and take, and ultimately that's your decision as the policymakers.
But is the hotel occupancy tax is clearly a ballot measure? Is the car rental tax?
Yes.
Also?
Yes, it'd be a separate proposition.
Okay, and those aren't combined, those are two separate
Correct. It'd be two
propositions.
separate.
Okay, that was my understanding, I just wanted to clarify.
So in theory, voters could approve one and not the other.
Right,
Yeah.
right, okay.
And the information from Cooksey,
Yes, Cooksey, yeah.
Cooksey, we're not expecting that until the end of January 2025, and then we would need to make a decision
Yeah, we expected in.
early February.
Yeah, we were targeting the second meeting in January to kind of walk through those results with you,
Okay.
which would give a couple of weeks, to kind of reflect on whether you wanted to call that in May. Again, I recognize that that's a very rushed timeline, but it's an option.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, obviously, there's lots to think about in this, both in terms of scope and timing and everything else, but certainly I think you've answered some of the questions specifically as to the roof, which I think were important, because I think we all had those. And so thanks for putting in the
Absolutely.
time to get that information.
And like I said, I'll forward you some additional information, and we can always touch base about how we want to proceed, in a different setting or however you like.
Very
Okay,
good.
great.
All right, thank you.
No problem. All right, so next up is a CIP update that's going to be provided by David.
Mr. Garza, can I suggest, would you just take a quick break real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let's do like a 10-minute break, and so that'll put us back here at 4:23.
Wait a minute.
Okay, so as everybody settles back into their seats, I was reminded, and I appreciate Ashley reminding me of it, because I did leave out from the presentation on the community center who's impacted by the hotel occupancy tax, right? I mean, I could have been more clear about that, but obviously if there is an adoption of a increase of the hotel occupancy tax, that obviously only applies to the people that stay in hotels, which aren't our local residents. The tax on car rentals is an across-the-board tax. And so that is a very important distinction that I could have been more transparent about, that the car rental tax part of it would in theory impact basically anybody that rents a car at our facility, regardless of whether they're visiting, local, regardless of whether insurance is paying or you're paying out of pocket, like just in general, it doesn't matter. That impact is a little bit more across the board. And so that may play a factor as well in your consideration on whether we pursue both of those or just one of those. And so just wanted to clarify that for full
thank you for doing that.
transparency. And so now we'll transition then to a CIP update. And as I mentioned before the break, David will spearhead that.
Good afternoon. I'm here today to provide you with an update on our capital improvements program. Since my last presentation on the CIP earlier in the year, there have been a few projects that have been added. These are VSTDC funded projects. I'll describe those for you shortly. And also we've had some time to review the budgets for the projects that were previously approved and update them according to current cost numbers, current bid prices. Then I'll summarize what those total cost variances are. Then I'll turn that over to Wesley Janacek to describe how to fund those additional costs. Back in August, I think it was, VSTDC approved some additional projects that were identified to be constructed or performed during the upcoming fiscal year. The I-69 corridor utilities, the engineering design for that, easement acquisition services for the I-69 corridor utilities. Also, Millette Drive mill and overlay project. In the original presentation or proposal on the 25 CIP, Millette Drive Mill and Overlay was going to be from Ball Airport Road to Briggs Boulevard. With the upcoming road closure for the bridge reconstruction, it was thought that we should go ahead and mill and overlay all the way down to Loop 463, have that road in really good condition for the increased traffic load it will be seeing during that construction period on the bridge. We'd like to add a right turn lane from Ball Airport Road onto Millette Drive there near the school, which will allow people to turn right as well as those turning left and facilitate the flow of traffic there at Schulemer Elementary School. We're also looking to, lost my place. Briggs Boulevard Bridge, the utility relocation project, the water line and sewer line, we came before you last week, a council meeting to award a project to Branch Construction Company to relocate a 12-inch water line, install new manhole, do some manhole rehabilitation. And also the Victoria Area Network fiber optic line relocation as part of the Briggs Boulevard project. Now we're going to discussing some of the cost increases we have seen or we project. Our overall cost for the residential paving project is $11.47 million. We are anticipating a $1.8 million increase over what we originally proposed. Of this, $0.22 million is for some additional work on Vine and Wagner Way. And an additional $1.75 million for the Bon Air Phase 1 subdivision street improvements. Now, this $1.75 million is an increase over and above the $2 million that we presented to council back in May. The residential drainage project will see no increase. That's still going to stay at 9.36. Yes, ma'am?
Just for curiosity, what caused such a significant increase over another significant increase? Was it just estimates, or did you add something to the project?
No, ma'am. It was just estimates.
Okay.
We performed an estimate based using prices from our bids on Tanglewood and College Park street reconstruction projects, which are going to be similar in nature, and we came up with this additional cost.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Just to refamiliarize yourself, the Bon Air Street reconstruction Phase 1, that is going to be from Azalea Street to the west to Lawrence Street, running from Red River up to Airline. And that is the addition, will require that additional $1.75 million. Now, Phase 2 will be following in fiscal year 2026. We have not put together an updated cost estimate on that, but we expect to see the required funds to increase also.
David, I'm going to interject there
Yes,
for a
sir.
second because we're beginning to see a consistent theme around our approach to fixing streets and neighborhoods. So we, for example, have discussed in previous conversations how expensive it would be to tackle the additional phases of Tanglewood. And now we're approaching a scenario where we might not be able to approach Phase 2 of Bon Air to the same degree that we anticipated years ago. Some of you may remember that when we 5 years ago hired a consultant to do an assessment of our street condition, the street condition assessment. Part of what the conversation was at the time about was looking at changing how we decide which streets get fixed. Because we knew then, and the consultant knew right away, because nobody really does it this way, that it would be cost prohibitive for us to redo entire neighborhoods at the same time. And we're beginning to see the reality of how difficult it is to actually do that. And so I think the increased cost of continuing that approach of redoing entire neighborhoods at the same time It's just, we're just going to be forced to change how we approach that. Now, the reason why we didn't change that approach 5 years ago, even though it was part of the recommendation from that study, was because we all felt that there was commitments that were made in conversations in public meetings to redo neighborhoods. And so we kind of said, okay, well, once we get past addressing some neighborhoods that we've discussed and have been discussed historically, then at that time frame, we'll get away from redoing complete neighborhoods at one go. But we're gonna probably be forced to change how we approach that sooner than what we wanted to because of just the cost of it. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that maybe instead of, phase 2 being one phase, maybe we have to take one street at a time. We've done that in other neighborhoods. We did that with, I think it was North Heights neighborhood, where it was 7 phases over 8 years, right? That's probably the type of approach that we're gonna have to start taking in all neighborhoods because these costs are just getting out of hand. And so I just want to put that bug in your ear because that conversation is coming in the future.
Well, then, we've had some discussion about the fact that our street evaluation study is a little bit out of date. And of course, rains and things change it too. But if we're going to have to start looking at doing single streets, I think it would be really significant to know which are the worst streets even within a neighborhood and have that information be more current.
Yeah, that's fair. It's a fair
Whether
point.
our solid waste drivers are the ones that tell us that, or, somebody that's on those streets, or.
Right. No, that's a good point. We'll certainly put some thought into that as we prepare for that possible conversation in the near future. Okay, carry on.
All right, thank you. Vine Street and Wagner Way, these two streets have come up in conversation fairly recently. We've got an estimate to go in and basically reclaim the streets, seal coat, 2-course seal coat to do both of these through all the way from Main Street up to the end of Vine, and then Wagner Way from Vine Street to the Union Pacific Railroad. This project could be done as part of the 2025 residential street project, which would be bid early in 2025, and most likely the construction would take place in the summer and early fall of 2025. We'd expect a completion date to be somewhere around October. It would also, if there's a reason for more expediency in completing this project, we could change order, add it into the scope of work on one of the existing paving projects. Currently, we've got a street rehab project that's taking place, Bridle Ridge subdivision of Vista del Sol subdivision. We could add this work onto the end of that if council were to so choose. That work could take place February, March of next year, and have that road back in service in good shape by that time.
And that is something that we would like direction on, even if it's not tonight, especially because if it's a change order. We want to be, and I want to be very mindful of council supporting change orders proactively before we bring them to you.
Any questions?
What's the time frame to have that done this way? Like how long would that road be out of commission to do this?
You mean while they're doing it?
Yes.
I would think 30 to 45 days on the outside.
Okay.
And it wouldn't be totally out of commission. It'd just be that'd be when the work is going on. They would probably would arrange times when trucks would pass across the work area, and there wouldn't be any conflicts between the road construction and the haul trucks either. Sure, we could work something out on that.
Thank you.
The thoroughfare streets proposed for fiscal year '25. All of these had fairly significant cost increases. Ben Wilson Street, that was going to be from Rio Grande to Houston Highway. We were looking at a $200,000 cost increase on that one. Ben Jordan, Ben Jordan that is going to be from Sam Houston all the way to Loop 463, a $400,000 cost increase. Millette Drive, that's a $200,000 increase, but part of the reason on the Millette Drive was we were looking at adding a right turn lane onto Briggs, which was not in the original, budget when it was conceived several years ago. John Stockbauer. This one has a $470,000 cost increase, primarily because when we presented this to you earlier in the year, we discussed doing an orderly progression. John Stockbauer mill and overlay has already taken place from Rio Grande to Airline. What was originally proposed was to go from Salem to Loop 463. Didn't really make a lot of sense to jump across like that, so we determined that we would go back to Airline and go to Ben Jordan. Well, when we did that, we did not revise the cost. We still kept the cost in there that was proposed for the Salem to Loop 463. So that was one of the reasons for the $470,000 increase there. Odom Street Mill and Overlay, that was a project that was originally proposed in 2024. It got moved to 25. So some of this is just due to cost increases from when it was originally proposed to when it is going to actually take place. Vine Street reconstruction. Originally as proposed was to be a full reconstruction from Red River all the way to Mockingbird. This would cost, to do this, we're anticipating a $640,000 increase. However, there could be some cost savings. We're proposed to have some corings done on the actual road asphalt between Red River and McWright. If the asphalt is in good enough condition, it's quite possible we could go in and just do a mill and overlay through that segment. And basically, we would see no cost increase at all from what our original budget was. But I think at this time, we want to look at it as though we would do the full reconstruction, look at the worst case, and then determine whether or not we can save those funds or not.
But ultimately, I think we are, looking at some point for direction on whether
Yes.
council's okay, because we've sold the Vine Street project as a complete reconstruction for that entire stretch. So we would basically need your okay if we're able to do the option that it doesn't necessitate increasing the budget. The final product would look no different than a complete reconstruct. But that section between Red River and McWright, or the park entrance, would just not be a complete reconstruction going all the way to the base material. And that's the section basically in front of the park, the main park entrance, all the way to the cemeteries. So that part is in better shape
Yeah, if it ain't,
compared to the section that goes from the park entrance to Mockingbird, right?
That part's not so bad.
Right, which is
Yeah.
why we're suggesting from park entrance to Mockingbird, completely reconstruct. From park entrance to cemeteries, we think we can get by just doing a mill and overlay.
And one thing we need
And
to,
that's the kind of creative thing that we need to start looking at doing in neighborhoods, rather than simply just going in and saying, let's just reconstruct all the streets. We need to start picking, this one needs to be reconstructed, this one doesn't, this one does, this one doesn't, so on and so forth.
I like the concept also of this part needs more work than this part. And so let's put what's needed, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yes.
Right,
To live by.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Have Gilbert press it.
I thought you were calling on me. I wasn't sure what you were doing there.
Yeah, you.
it's not advancing right
He wanted you to say something.
Right.
now. No?
Wrong way.
Okay. I did, oh. Gilbert did it. He
All right,
just
let's go.
kinda- Okay, utility projects we got proposed for fiscal year 2025. One of those is Anthony Road sewer line replacement. We're looking at a cost increase of $730,000. This is based upon a cost estimate we received from our design engineer, urban engineering, just last week. So no, this is fairly current. Northeast Water Street, there's water line replacement from the railroad over to Wan Lin. That's $720,000 increase. That is also due from the design engineer's opinion of probable cost. And this is a summary of the cost increases that we are anticipating. On our residential streets, we're looking at an overall cost increase of $1.8 million. And for our utility projects, a cost increase of $1.65 million. And on our thoroughfare projects, cost increase of $2.2 million, for a total increase of $5.65 million. Now I'm going to let Wesley Janacek explain how those funds can be acquired.
You have 5 minutes, Wesley.
All right, I'll go fast. All right, so you've heard from David on the cost estimates coming in over budget, and I will discuss our plan for covering this funding gap of approximately $5.65 million. So on the table here on the right, this shows the additional funding that's needed for the projects based on the original funding sources. So for the CO bonds, we need an additional $1.7 million for bonds that were, or for projects that were originally funded by that. For general fund, it's additional $1 million, et cetera. With that said, we have identified $2.2 million in funds, in the city's construction funds, that can help offset these costs, which our recommendation is there in the available column. You see the $2.2 million there offsetting all the general fund costs, and then a portion of utility fund and sales tax. What this $2.2 million is made up of is interest income that we've accumulated in the construction fund, plus a future projection of interest income. We think roughly will be about $971,000. We've got leftover funds from projects that were closed out just this past month. We had the 2024 mill and overlay project that closed out, $620,000 under the contract amount, and then the 2024 residential project that closed out $329,000 under contract, which added an additional $949,000 that we could reallocate to these projects. In addition to that, we'd be proposing to use $300,000 from the fund balance of the TxDOT overpass fund. Now, to bridge the gap of the remaining costs that we see there in the needed column, we would propose increasing the 2025 CO bond issue by the $1.75 million, which would bring that total issuance to just under $7.8 million. To give you an idea of that tax rate impact, it would be about 0.2 cents, which is, yes, less than a penny. For a home valued at $250,000, it's about $6 for the year that they would see an increase in their taxes. And then we would recommend amending the utility fund budget by $730,000. At the previous meeting, we did present how that updated projection on working capital is coming in for utility fund. And with this amendment, we would still remain above the minimum reserve for that fund. And then lastly, we would propose amending the sales tax budget by $953,000. Now, these recommendations would allow us to address the increase in these costs without having to delay any of the projects, so we can continue on the plan that we originally had, and doesn't create any major financial strain on the city funds. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
The only thing that I'll add is that, and y'all know this, we can always stop and not do a project.
Right.
So it's technically always an option for you to just say, hey, we're not gonna do that project anymore. Or delay a project or whatever the case may be. So know that those are options for you as well. We typically approach it as, this is what it'll take to follow through with what we've committed to do. And that's why the presentation before you. But you always have the option to cut, reduce, change, delay. Just know that that's there if you want it.
These numbers do not reflect the possible $600,000 in savings to change Vine, correct?
You just took my thunder.
Sorry.
Two comments. One, exactly. Thank you very much, Doctor. You know, you still got, if we're going with that $600,000 savings, that will knock it off of that prior CO.
Okay.
Point of clarification, Wesley did the math correct about the $6 increase, but it's not necessarily the net effect, because if you just take this year's number, not compare it to last year's number, that's not the overall net effect. So it's very minimal. When you look, well, last year was 5.5, this year is $6, so the net increase for that house is maybe 20 cents or 30 cents. So I just want to make sure that's clear. It's not $6. Okay, I got that off my chest. Thank you.
The text dot overpass fund, I always thought it was gone,
I knew you were going
and the
there.
money keeps coming
It
out.
grows and grows.
How
Let me
much money
explain.
is in it?
Well, I think we had this conversation in the budget. It was over slightly 500. Well, actually, if you want to know the cash, I got over, is it $3 million? Because you got to remember, I got pledged $3 million from that tech stop fund for the public safety. I haven't touched that money yet to pay off that building construction yet. You understand that? So I'm still accumulating interest.
Well, how much do you have that's unencumbered?
Right now, I thought it was 500. I'm gonna use, we take 300 for this project. We still got 200 left. There it is. And I think that 200 was pledged towards your capital construction fund, all the ERP, thank you. That's it. Now, one more thing, sir. I'm not guaranteeing there's no money in there after that because I have interest. Now, if you want to move it out completely and drain it, we can do that. But the point is, it's there. It's full disclosure. Sorry.
Let's time out for 30 seconds because I doubt that our two new council members have any idea what we're talking about when we reference the text dot overpass fund.
I'll think about, maybe you came in 2020.
19.
2019. Around 2018, 2019. Now, let me go back further than that.
It's only a
Once upon
30-second break.
time- No,
It's only a 30-second summary.
15 years ago. About 15, let's say 15 years ago, we issued bonds. That overcross TxDOT road, that 463, we helped fund that operation with TxDOT, okay? And one way we got money for us to repay that, we pledged some money from our cash from sales tax, and also the county pledged about $1 or $2 million. That's it. That's all they did. We leveraged $16 million. I want that public record. But anyway, so with that stated, we got money in return from the car usage, all that, that loop section. And that's how we fund the bond for all these years. When, in 2018, 2019, TxDOT approached us, hey, we want to get rid of this. Would you take a present value cash right now for the remaining year of this? And it was about, I want to say close to $3 million, some change. And I did the number and say, hell yeah, we take the number. So we took that cash and we created this so-called TxDOT fund. Money that we have a windfall in a way, but we leverage our interest and pay the principal and all that. That was on our risk. So we capitalized on that. Now, with that said, that money was used to do a lot of master plan studies, some other infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been going from 3, we're down to 5. And you're right, Mr. Law. That money you would think it would disappear one year. But, over the past 2-3 years, we had interest rate around the 4 and 5% easy. When you apply that to money that you have pledged on the public safety building, I'm going to earn interest. And I'm sorry, but I like that. And I'm going to use that on something else. And it's in the budget. It's full disclosure. It's in your quarterly report too as well. So anyway, so right now, as I stand at this particular day, you might have about $500,000 unallocated. But if you want to see the cash, you got about $4 million because I got 3 point something still to pay out in public safety.
Right.
Go ahead.
And for some historical context, back in that time frame, 2019, 2020, Gilbert's right. One of the very first things that, was important for me is planning, right? And so we literally, budgeted to do downtown master plan, parks master plan, drainage master plan. There was all these studies and plans that we were doing. And rightfully so, right? We were sensitive to the source of money that we were using for those plans. And so this TxDOT fund helped pay for that so that the message to our taxpayers was that we're not using taxpayer dollars to hire consultants. We're using this other source of funds to do that. And that has helped shape and form, much of what we're doing now, which is using taxpayer dollars, right? But if it weren't for that fund, it would have been challenging for us to secure the funding to do all the plans that we did.
Yeah, I left one thing item out, and when Texas gave us the money, they gave us the money for the bond outstanding, plus I had that $3 million, that's the windfall I was talking about. I took the money that is for the debt, we paid off that debt early, about 4 or 5 years ahead of time. Just want to let you know that. So that's how that's taken care of, and the 3 million was just a windfall after savings and all that.
Okay,
A mic drop.
so do you have another slide after this? Okay, so it sounds like we obviously will be needing direction from you on basically issuing more debt to basically cover the extra costs to complete the Bon Air project. And then, of course, we have to approach VSTDC for budget amendments and things of that sort. But the bigger one probably is the issuance of the additional debt that we needed some kind of guidance on. Because we normally, I mean, we're planning on doing that already in January.
Right, we would close on those funds in March, but we are planning to bring the notice of intent next week, so we need a final number so we know what to put in that resolution.
And if you're
Okay.
gonna have that leftover, it's, 1.1.
Well, to me, it seems like you go back to what we've struggled before is once you've committed to a neighborhood and once you've committed to a project and put it out there, I have a hard time saying, oh, well, no, we're pulling it back. Just personal thought, because I know we ran into some of this with COVID when things were on the agenda, we're gonna do this. Of course, COVID was a different animal and got pulled back. Well, we still haven't gotten back to some of those things that were on the list then. And so I hesitate to say, well, let's pull them off of the list, because once you commit to them, I think we ought to do what we can to get them done. But that's just from my standpoint.
Well, on the same token, though, I've just went through the book that we have from 25, 26, and 27, and I couldn't find Tanglewood in it at all. So we did phase 1. We've created 3 phases. I've been on council since 2015, trying to get Tanglewood fixed. And, so I agree, once we commit to something, that people have that expectation, but there's one that we've committed to that we still haven't gotten to. And it makes me wonder, now there's a downside to phasing a subdivision too. If you make it too small, then it's not cost effective for the contractor. And I know that our staff already knows that, and they factor that in. Because I was ready to say, why don't we, look at a smaller phase? But I don't think it's going to do that much good for us.
Well,
Yeah,
I
can
think your point about Tanglewood is well taken from the standpoint that I think council as a whole, although most of that was pre-me, council as a whole has learned from mistakes made there. And some of the mistakes made there, I think, we're still dealing with. We pulled it off the list and now we're still dealing with it, which is exactly what I'm trying to avoid here. Let's not create Tanglewood 2, is what I'm getting at.
Right, but again, keep in mind that Bon Air does have a phase 2 piece to it that we don't know when and if we'll get to it. My rebuttal, real quick, that I think is relevant is, yes, you're correct, that if we slice a neighborhood into smaller chunks, it obviously does increase the mobilization, because there's company going out there every year for 5, 6, 7 years, and obviously the expense of that's only gonna go up. But North Heights is a perfect example. We designed North Heights in-house because it was smaller chunks. And so we need to also look at, okay, when we do these large residential holistic neighborhood projects, we don't have the bandwidth to design those projects in-house. So it literally costs us millions of dollars to contract with an urban or a civil corps to design those. But when we break it down into smaller chunks, we can do that in-house. So while we might be increasing the cost of construction by breaking it down into smaller chunks, we're saving from not having to outsource the engineering of it. Now, I'm not saying that's a wash, but it certainly is something that happens once you do break it down to smaller segments.
I have a question about the Bon Air project. You saved money, we've saved money because we looked at Vine Street and saw a part that we didn't have to totally reconstruct. did we look at Bon Air and say, well, we have to do all these, what we're doing, or is there any way to save money in the Bon Air project or in the phase two Bon Air project?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that question would be, but I believe we did the utilities for Bon Air first though, right? And so one of the things to take into account when we do these large neighborhood projects is that we go in and we tear up the streets to do utilities. So then it basically behooves us to come in and fix the street, right? With Vine Street, we're not messing with utilities. So it does make it a little bit easier to take some chunks and not completely reconstruct them because we're not digging to replace pipes.
And I know I'm a council member and know nothing about building streets, but Bon Air is an example where each of the streets is connected and there's probably the same amount of traffic on each of them versus a different subdivision that may have a cul-de-sac that doesn't have very much traffic on it. And I'm liking what we're talking about on Vine of looking at the street and seeing what's needed where. And I just wonder whether there's any room for that too, to look at individual streets in a subdivision. I know the downside one that I can think of is that then when you're done, the whole subdivision won't be uniform. And so that could be a problem, but I've always advocated for if there's a lot of traffic in an area, beef that street up instead of doing the whole subdivision.
That's a perfect comment, Ms. Jan. And
To
one of the
show
things
that I
David
shouldn't
and
be building streets.
Yeah, you say you don't know about street, come on. But no, we're kind of looking into the future, but that's part of his job moving forward, is that, okay, how can we this is our situation on a dollar situation. How can we minimize this effect moving forward? And you're right, Mark, this cannot continue because we'll be draining things faster than normal. So it's going to be up to staff situation when in the coming months that we got to dig in. And I can see back in coming March when we come up with another presentation, those questions should be answered and we'll have it for you, okay?
Can you go back to the slide with the projects that show the increase for each project? And can you go back a few slides?
This one?
Further back.
Further back.
With the individual, not the water projects, the water projects. Yeah, that one.
Yes, sir.
What's the question?
This doesn't have Wagner, where's the Wagner Way one?
It was before this one, I think.
It was a separate slide.
The 217,000.
Can you go back to the Wagner Way one too? I'd like to see them all. Sorry to hold it up here, but. And Wagner Way was just Wagner Way? Was it Vine Street in front?
It was Vine and
Yeah, it
Water.
was Wagner and Vine. Can we not move the slide deck or what?
Do we really need to fix Vine in
Goes
front
Gilbert.
of that place?
So basically, what's highlighted in yellow, Mark, on this slide, which is consistent with what we've discussed
But
in
did people
ES.
go out this way,
And Silcoat.
or did they go down this way? Because we were talking about closing this off.
Correct, these people.
Yeah. If we need to have a executive session conversation about this area,
Yeah.
we need to have it in executive session.
We
I don't know
need-
where you're headed with the conversation, but I know that part of this conversation is an executive session conversation.
Okay,
I have
But
a
the road's in bad shape.
question before
well, I know that.
this section is over. It looked like there was a 14% increase from overall, and I'm just wondering, since I'm fairly new, is that normal to have that much of an increase from the bid to the final project?
I think there's several factors that play a part in that 14% increase. Excuse me. Some of the original budget numbers were prepared maybe 3-4 years ago, and they've been carried forward. We have not adjusted them. Now, we've also recently seen this past year, the actual bid prices be considerably higher than what our earlier estimates were. So we said, we know they're probably going to be higher. Let's apply these costs to these projects before, and know have a better idea of what we're going to see when actual bids come in.
Right. And that's what I wanted to mention, because these adjusted estimates, these projects haven't been bid out yet. So all we're simply suggesting is that based off of the projects that have been bid out this year, we think that when we do bid them out, they're going to increase by this amount. But we technically won't know until they actually get bid out. And they might come in less than what we're estimating. They might come in more. Sometimes how many bids we get plays a factor. We've discussed how one of our biggest challenges is that we don't have enough companies submit bids. So we're basically at the mercy of the one bidder that always bids, because there's no competition for that. And that it's just, I mean, I hate to be that blunt about it, but that's certainly a factor.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that because I was sitting back there. But the other part, let's say you do the CO, because that's going to be in February. That money can still be used on the following CIP. Instead of doing the 8, I just do 7. Capiche? You understand? So you're not use it now, use it later. So the CO is not an issue.
It comes in under. I hope that helped.
It's certainly more information
Yeah.
to chew on.
So well put.
Mayor, as I alluded to you during the break, we will push out the last item on tonight's agenda and move that to next week, so that we can go straight into executive session. I will need 5 minutes of your time for executive session.
Okay, so then it is 5:01, and we will take a very short break, because I know several of us have a engagement with the college this evening that we need to get to. And so let's take a very short break, and we will re-adjourn into executive session.
The City Council recessed for executive session on the 10th day of December, 2024 at 5:01 PM. Subject matter is as follows: Texas Government Code 551.087.